Hello, everyone. Welcome to the JIIA webinar. I'm your host today, Koichiro Matsumoto, Director of Programs and Research. We, the Japan Institute of International Affairs, have been organizing webinars inviting fascinating speakers like the guests we have here today. But after the lapse of several years due to COVID, I wish to announce that we are resuming this webinar series once again. Today, I'm pleased to have here Dr. Giulio, lecturer in Japanese politics and international relations at the University of Oxford. Giulio joined the Nissan Institute of Japanese Studies as a British Academy postdoctoral fellow, and from 2021, he assumed the position of departmental lecturer in Japanese politics and international relations. Giulio specializes in domestic Japanese and international politics and international economics of the Asia-Pacific with a focus on Japan, China, and the United States. He's a regular contributor of leading journals, and he co-authored the book entitled Sino-Japanese Power Politics, Might, Money, and Minds. Giulio earned a BA in political science in East Asian studies at the University of Naples, and he also has an MA in international economics, international relations at SAIS, Johns Hopkins University. He completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge after extensive field work in Tokyo. But I think the headline here is that he managed to switch sides from Cambridge to Oxford. Well, that's, I think, is an achievement itself. Giulio kindly invited me to speak at St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford in November. I spoke about East Asia security policy there, but he made so many, thought-provoking comments after my talk, and that led me to believe that I should bring this guy to Tokyo in front of the wonderful audience here at JIIA. So that's why he's here with us today. Now, the title of this talk is Europe's Growing Alignment on China with Japan and the United States, Trends and Prospects of Japan-Europe Security Cooperation. This is such a fascinating topic that everybody has been longing to hear about. I would also like to welcome Dr. Stephen Nagy, Professor, Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University and fellow here at the JIIA. Stephen has been teaching and researching on international relations and regional issues in Indo-Pacific for over 25 years. He received a PhD in international relations from Waseda University, and he has been a regular in this JIIA webinar before the COVID struck, so many of you zoomed in for today may be familiar. Today, I should like to ask him to make comments after Giulio's initial remarks, and warm welcome to you, Stephen. Before opening the floor, I have a couple of housekeeping announcements. First, after the initial remarks by the speakers, we will open the floor for questions. Those of you joining us via Zoom, please type in your questions in English using the Q&A function of the Zoom. You may send your questions even before the speakers finish their statements, and I look forward to receiving many interesting questions and comments. So without further ado, I wish to ask Giulio to make initial remarks for probably 50 minutes, followed by Stephen's comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Koichiro, for your kind introduction, and thank you for having me. And I look forward to learning from Stephen's comments and criticism, I hope. And from the also from the floor, from the virtual and physical floor. As Koichiro mentioned, my remit is really Japanese politics, especially Japan's international relations. But just like Japan in recent years has expanded its strategic horizons to include the Indo-Pacific writ large, from the eastern shores of Africa to the Western Pacific, and to actually expand its presence, I have also expanded my academic remit to venture and try to understand what happens at the opposite end of the Euro-Asiatic, of the Eurasian landmass, and nominally what Europe, especially continental Europe, the European Union and its member states are doing with respect to this region, specifically East Asia. And that's why, in addition to my position at Oxford, I'm privileged to have a part-time professorship at the European University Institute in EU-Asia Studies, which is, of course, as you know, the European Union's university in Fiesole, in the beautiful hills facing Florence. And I'll need my slides uploaded if possible right now. So I'll try to be pithy. I'll try not to be the over loquacious Italian here. And forgive me, give me a bit of leeway, because in fact, this talk I would like to, yes, talk about policy and recent developments, but also take a step backwards and look at a broader view and a broader question, to also give you a sense of my academic research and perhaps pitch a couple of articles of mine, which are open access. The key question is, and I'll focus on continental Europe again, why did the EU and key member states of the EU embrace the so-called Indo-Pacific? The answers given to these questions have been multiple, and we can explore them in the Q&A question. But I would argue that heightened threat perceptions vis-à-vis China, also in non-traditional security matters such as cyber, economic security, the lack of a level playing field, that prompted a rethink of the European Union's relationship with China in 2019 with the so-called Trinity China strategy, which described China not just as a potential partner in global governance issues such as climate change, but also as an economic competitor and, importantly, as a systemic rival. And I would still argue that the EU, especially France, tries to cut away a so-called third way that is suspicious of China's rise, also because of French interests in the region, but is also not fully aligned with the United States' position. And the United States' position, especially in concert with Japan, under the Biden administration, has tried to merge two theaters, the Indo-Pacific with the Euro-Atlantic. This was effectively evident with the importance that the United States has acquired following Russia's illegal war of aggression in Ukraine. And to paraphrase Macron, the effective strategic dependency that has elicited from Europe in terms of relying on US military and security contributions for the security of the continent writ large. This is also helped by the von der Leyen presidency, the Geopolitical Commission, and her chief of staff, especially in particular, and has prompted also a rethink in public opinion and elite opinion writ large, one that lumped up, in my opinion, mistakenly so, Russia's imperialism in its near abroad with China's irredentism vis-à-vis Taiwan. And this is also part and parcel of the fact that there is now a stronger demonization of China taking root in public opinion writ large, one that perhaps misses the point and the key differences between the two actors. But importantly, the Indo-Pacific is an important keyword to let us understand that rethink, because it was a bit of a dirty word in Europe up until, I would say, the last year of the Trump presidency, when a non-paper circulated by France, Germany, and the Netherlands tried to really then push for the 2021 EU strategy, cooperation strategy in the Indo-Pacific. But it was a dirty word because it was associated with the maximalist pushback that the Trump administration elicited against China, and because China was still and is still, to many in Europe, an important economic market. But we get to the point where the Indo-Pacific concept has been embraced, and we can list different actors and how they have embraced it. And there is now actually a fuller embrace, one that, for instance, in joint statements with Japan, this was evident in 2022, The European Union and the Commission refers to it as free and open Indo-Pacific. If you read the EU-Japan joint statement from the May 2022 summit, there is clear, explicit reference to a free and open Indo-Pacific, but also to a condemnation of coercive activities in the East and South China Seas, and explicit reference to the Senkaku Islands, rather than Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, because of course the official position is that there is a dispute in countries other than Japan, including the United States. So there is an alignment, and that alignment is interesting and suggests that there is a growing willingness to beef up in traditional and non-traditional security spheres the European presence and role. And why is that? Certainly, military signaling and presence has been ramping up. This has been welcome and, in fact, elicited by Japan, more so than the United States, I would add, because it plays up to this concert of middle powers that are here to defend the so-called rules-based international order, defend freedom of overflight, of navigation. And in the Nikkei Asia, it was news last year that Japan now more effectively is involved in joint military exercises as much as twice per week. Of course, the partner of choice is the United States of America, but growingly so also with European players. Italy itself, and quietly so perhaps, has sent its multi-purpose patrol vessel, Jewel of the Crown of Fincantieri, to as many as 14 Indo-Pacific countries, making 15 port calls, and engaged in joint military exercises with Japan as well. Italy has been sending up this summer F-35s to Japan, the first big country to send F-35s to the region. And I would add that this is not deterrence in the strict sense, but really it's a way to buttress customary law and to make the case for preserving the so-called rules-based order. But still, there are also competitive dynamics which we should take into account. France, through its expertise, France and JIIA, this is the German counterpart, led foreign policy initiative within the European Union, has tried to advance a degree of security cooperative dossiers with like-minded partners such as France, such as Japan and South Korea, but also with Southeast Asian players such as Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore. And it has done so not just to enhance best practices and export soft skills in, for instance, capacity building, for instance, by endowing and by giving elements to improve the understanding of international law and customary law to littoral states, or by, for instance, improving cooperation in fighting disinformation. This is a project that the University of Tokyo is advancing with JIIA money. And it's not just about Russia, of course, it's potentially also about China. But it's also, and this is particularly true of France, because I'm an academic and so I take no prisoners. I have the privilege of being quite frank and straightforward, of selling potential assets and selling potential technology. And so the Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative under the Crimario, the expanded remit of Crimario, goes also through the ability for France to perhaps endow regional states with its IORIS platform. And this has an impact on the economic, but also on the military potentially side because of the ability to share data. But it potentially runs counter to the initiatives that Japan, for instance, and Quad countries have tried to launch, notably last year at a Quad summit, notably the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative. What is interesting is that then, if you look carefully, there is not just an alignment which stems from a growing appreciation of the challenge posed by China and of the dependency vis-à-vis the United States. There is also a willingness to, of course, capitalize on that security engagement for economic and mercantile reasons, because, of course, the region is booming in terms of economic prosperity, notably in India and Southeast Asia. And those are markets that can be tapped upon. And those are production outposts, if you want to take a broader definition of security, where supply chains can be relocated away from China. But those are also booming markets in the security sphere. And so, as Japan's three strategic documents make clear and the National Defense Build-up Program make clear, there is going to be an increase of around 60% in military spending. But, you know, this is true also of South Korea's white paper from last year, if I'm not mistaken, which has announced a massive naval expansion. And it's also true of the military expansion of littoral states in Southeast Asia, of India's procurement. And India is interesting, of course, because it needs to rely away from Russia more and more because of the inability to procure weapons and systems from Russia. Now that Russia is bogged down in its war in Ukraine. And so there is a potential then market also in terms of security assets, platforms, software, and whatnot, that is appetizing, if you want, to European players. And the security logic may also be used as a sort of like linkage for economic ones. The United Kingdom's willingness to leverage its security presence and its security embrace of the region helped, in my opinion, its early accession to CPTPP. So that diplomatic and political engagement might have served also the UK's economic benefits. And so this is an article I have written in a journal, and I encourage you to read it because it's actually open source. Now, to conclude in actually 5 minutes more, and I'm very sorry to abuse of the floor's patience, so I'll go for 20 minutes. This speaks to the more recent developments. The US and Japan has actually operated in many ways as aggregative powers in the region. Aggregative powers that have actually enabled for greater presence from faraway countries, so-called like-minded countries. And this is evident, for instance, by the provision of access. You see a flourishing of acquisition and cross-services and reciprocal access agreements in the region. Notably, Japan has signed such agreements with, for instance, Australia, the United Kingdom, and much more, of course, are in the making with, of course, Germany, France, Canada, even Italy might be one case in the future. This was moving the military presence by these actors. And Italy has, through journalistic reports from earlier this year, made clear that it might send a career battle group as well in the future. And this logic is evident also by access provided, for instance, by US military bases in the region, such as Guam, where French and British vessels can also be positioned, or even Australia, where notably Japan might send an aircraft, well, a helicopter/aircraft carrier away from the first island chain, because of course China now has career killers. So you see that there is an interlinking. This might also apply to the Philippines, that through a concerted effort, through what the United States calls integrated deterrence, somehow manages to come up with a concert of middle powers, but one that is increasingly aligned with the US. Okay, this is also thanks to the Biden administration, to strategic thinkers such as Kurt Campbell, and we see the so-called interlocking of the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic clearly also by the fact that through American and Japanese good efforts, you have now, and also Australian and South Koreans, you have now the embrace of the so-called Asia-Pacific Four. Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, but especially Japan, having their tailored partnership agreements with NATO and having being part of course, of being global partners of NATO. So, to basically conclude, what are then the prospects? We see more and more intelligence sharing. The US, through its ability to put China high on the agenda of the NATO strategic concept of last year, is able to share intelligence and to socialize European players to the United States government understanding of a China threat. The ability for standardization of weapon systems, ammunitions, and whatnot through tailored partnership programs might help in the case of a Taiwan contingency scenario, where European players might even then provide support, not directly so by intervening in the theater, but by providing assets or ammunition, just like South Korea did through linkages and triangulation in Ukraine, or just like Japan did through non-lethal military support, including notably civil drones, which may have a dual use. But you also see cooperation in the non-traditional sphere. You see military exercises in the cyber domain, hybrid warfare, Japan being, together with South Korea, a member of the Center of Excellence in Estonia, NATO Center of Excellence in Estonia. And you also see more and more alignment in the economic security agenda between the EU and Japan. I would say that NATO and economic security is less important than meets the eye, because the European Union wanted to preserve that dossier. Economic security sometimes is a bit of a tricky dossier, because sometimes it's a fig leaf for protectionist and industrial policy, and it might actually run detrimental to European member states' interests. So economic security is really a prerogative of the EU and its member states. And we have an anti-coercion instrument. An anti-coercion instrument that the EU has announced this year, but that notably is about China, but it was initially, to start with, it was about Trump. It was about the first Trump presidency. Let's not forget that. There is still an anti-coercion platform which is in its embryonic form at the G7 level. There are some states in the G7, including Italy, and I imagine also Germany, that are a bit more timid about the anti-coercion platform and perhaps don't want to have this sort of like retaliatory definition that the US or the UK or maybe even Japan would like to acquire. But there is also cooperation, and it's a multi-layered one. Let's not forget that this is in addition to what is happening at the EU-US level on disinformation. The Global Engagement Center now has a partnership and a collaboration with the Stratcom task force in the EU level. And there is also growing cooperation in disinformation between the EU and Japan. There is potentially cooperation in connectivity, not necessarily in East Asia perhaps, but closer to home. But the key incognita are, with two wars ravaging in Europe's neighborhood, and clearly with domestic politics preoccupying more and more, not just Europe, but also Japan, we will certainly turn more, not necessarily inward looking, but more interested in prioritizing our neighborhood. This is a given, and this is clear from the priorities of Italy's G7 presidency. Italy's G7 presidency will be preoccupied with human security, food security, energy security, climate, and the global south, yes, but it will be really all mostly be about the enlarged Mediterranean. It will be all about the migration crisis, and the migration crisis impacts on the domestic politics of Europe. Populism is making a comeback in Europe, and populism, of course, is making a comeback also in the United States of America. And so we can't take the Biden administration's very cooperative strategy for granted. We might get a more mercantile United States, one that first and foremost will be anti-EU. In the region, it might be more skeptic of Korea, perhaps. Japan might actually find benefits in a Trump 2.0 administration. We might discuss this, but I think I'll just leave it open for Q&A. I'm sorry for actually being the over loquacious Italian, and also for engaging in some propaganda. This is the article I mentioned. And this is the other article, which is in French. And I'll stop here, but I'll stop with this screen.
Thank you very much. Merci
Thank you.
beaucoup. So many interesting takeaways. The word third way reminds me of Tony Blair, because I used to live in Great Britain in the 20th century, and that it's really interesting that this kind of term comes back in a different meaning, in a different concept. And I sensed from your talk that Europe is waking up to the challenge posed by the assertiveness of China, and many countries are, waking up to this challenge and believes that no longer they can sit on the fence, but with some few exceptions. And I think we're going to talk about that soon. And I will pass the floor to Stephen.
So thanks very much, Koichi, and thanks very much, Giulio, for a really great presentation. So you asked me for comments or criticism. So I'm going to touch upon two that I would like to push back a little bit on, and then raise three questions. And I guess the first comment or pushback is you drawing a strong connection between the US linking the Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific region. And I'm wondering if you could drill down into that a little bit more. At least how I see it is that we're actually the US is trying to enhance the burden sharing within the region, ensuring that the Europeans are dealing with the Russian theater and helping the Ukrainians and stepping up to the plate in the Atlantic area, allowing for the US to concentrate its resources and building those critical minilateral relationships within the Indo-Pacific region to deal with the challenges that are emerging. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, because I maybe just how you articulated it was a little bit different. Second, you brought up this idea of middle powers, and I do quite a bit of work on middle powers, and I guess my conceptualization of middle powers today is that in the 1990s, we were talking about a rules-based order and buttressing the international system and working with our traditional ally, the United States. But today, I think, of course, we have challenges such as China in the region, Russia, North Korea, but the United States is a much less predictable power. And as a result, as I see middle powers, that we're not just working as a coalition against and preserving a rules-based order, but part of that preserving the rules-based order is influencing, lobbying the United States to do the right thing, whether it's under the Biden administration or the potential Trump administration. And I think Prime Minister Abe, the late Prime Minister Abe, was a very good example of that. He was lobbying and pushing the United States in a better direction. So I'm wondering if you can maybe touch upon that as well, because I think middle powers are not just aligning against, for example, revisionist powers, but also their friend who's also a revisionist power, the United States, which is something that I think we're going to have to really think about. So just a couple pushbacks against how you articulated your ideas. And then in terms of questions, there's lots to, I guess, we can be talking about. But one, and I think the way you articulated it is the third way, I'm wondering how the EU visualizes the Indo-Pacific region evolving in the future. Is it going to be one that's shaped by the US-China strategic rivalry, a G2 kind of Indo-Pacific, or are they also looking towards creating a multipolar region where they strengthen the strategic autonomy of ASEAN? They help build India, so it's also a pole within the region that diffuses the power within the region, so that it's not just the US-China shaping the region, but other partners, again, shaping the region. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Second, I want to drill down into a little bit about NATO-Japan cooperation. You touched upon intelligence sharing, standardization, and cooperation with NATO. So I'm wondering how you can, if you can conceptualize that a little bit more in terms of being more aligned with the challenges in the Indo-Pacific and how Japan and NATO can cooperate. And is disinformation, cyber, the sphere that allows for, I guess, the most productive cooperation that suits Japan's and NATO's regional priorities? And perhaps lastly, and importantly, I'm curious how Europe is looking at the Indo-Pacific and China as the Chinese economy continues to structurally move in a negative direction, and how this will potentially cause more destabilization within the region. Is there an area of cooperation between the Japanese and Europe in terms of managing this structural decline? And I ask this question because I think some commentators think we can live without the Chinese economy. I'm not one of them. I think that we have an interest in stabilizing the Chinese economy, but maybe not an interest in stabilizing the current political trends domestically. So I'll stop there and look forward to your response. Thanks again for the great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I need 20 more minutes, I guess. I'll try to be very brief. Thank you. These are very thought-provoking comments and criticisms, and I'm delighted to try to address them. I'm not sure I will do justice to them. So on the first pushback, yes, there is a tension. There is a tension between the rhetoric, and I see really also initiatives aimed at joining the Euro-Atlantic with the Indo-Pacific, and joining hands, if you want, with the US as the key middleman, Venacodo, if you want, that kind of like intercedes for this arranged marriage between Europe and Indo-Pacific players such as Japan and South Korea, especially, or Australia for this matter. But I think that under the Biden administration, if it's true that there is a willingness, and there is certainly a debate that is in line with the thinking of Elbridge Colby, who worked under the Trump administration, according to which the best bet, not just for Europe, but even for Japan, is to take care of their neighborhood, right? This is the realist sort of like 101 understanding that, the US will take care of China, Japan will take care of China, Europe should, mind its own business, and that's how things should work. And this is exactly why I think Europe is actually quite concerned about the advent of a second Trump administration, precisely because, like what happened in Afghanistan, the United States under Biden, the United States will more fully tilt eastward. I'm less persuaded that this is how the Biden administration really thinks in full. I see a tension. As I mentioned, Afghanistan was part of that tension. I see also a willingness to, of course, occupy a space in the region. The US wants to be indispensable and wants to be also selling its own weapon systems and have an important presence in the region. And it will stay. In Northeast Asia, vis-a-vis South Korea and Japan, it still has a lot of power and intelligence and, logistical in terms of nuclear deterrence. It has an incredible leverage. And it's really impossible to hedge really away from the risks of a US abandonment or a G2. There's no choice. I don't see Europe or middle powers somehow really beefing up Japan's position. Maybe yes, in this gets me to the second question as well. In caging some of the US more disruptive revisionist instincts at the WTO, for instance. But as we see, the US is still able to sabotage the WTO by emasculating the appellate body, notwithstanding what Japan and the European Union and Australia too are trying to do to say, no, well, wait a minute. So in global governance, clearly there is an attempt by middle powers to cage the United States, as you say, with mixed results. But I do see at the same time the US trying to link up the Euro-Atlantic with the Indo-Pacific, and notably the NATO AP4 link up is because of the US as well playing the middleman there. And the standardization, for instance, the potential for standardization of weapon systems and whatnot, and the ability for the US clearly to ask South Korea, to ask Japan, to ask Australia and whatnot to also help Europe out in Ukraine by giving and providing support, lethal, non-lethal, economic, which of course is important. I see that as clearly a willingness to link up with the two theaters. So there is a tension. I recognize it, but that tension it clearly tilts in favor of a multi-layered ad hoc coalitions of the willing, if you want, and minilaterals that are dossier specific. The Quad itself might open up to some European players. There is, I think, interest on the United States, I imagine there, as there is perhaps on Japan's side. And that willingness to work together is important with dossiers that are non-traditional security dossiers like cyber, AI, those that transcend boundaries and geographic boundaries. And so there you can see that cooperation can certainly take ground precisely because there is expertise, there is technological prowess, there is technological know-how in Europe, and there is vice versa, especially in East Asia. So there is the ability to cooperate. And that interlinkage is evident also when you take into consideration the fact that Western Europe, that Europe as a whole is a massive economic player. And so any talk about potential for sanctions vis-a-vis China, clearly, or the potential for cooperation, economic security cooperation, is clearly very important because of the sheer size and technological prowess of Europe. So again, this transcends boundaries, and so it's an easier, lower-hanging fruit, perhaps. So I've tried to address both points of criticism at the beginning, and in fact, this also touches on the NATO-Japan cooperation dossiers. It has to do with stuff that transcends boundaries. Europe might even give weapons or ammunition in the case of a Taiwan contingency, intelligence. So again, stuff that necessarily it's not that politically difficult to provide. I think that aspirationally the EU, which is an international and intergovernmental body made up of mostly small and medium powers. Sorry, France. I would include France as well among them. Thrives and relies necessarily on an international order, just like Japan, that is premised on rules and effective multilateralism, not one dictated by raw power politics where might makes right. So clearly there is an unwillingness to have the law of the jungle, one that is dictated not just by revisionist China, but potentially by the United States, more disruptive United States. And so effective multilateralism is in the interest of these polities, right? The EU, Europe, and Japan. To what extent this is feasible in this more complicated world of ours is debatable. not least because we have to make compromises more and more. We keep talking about the rule of law. We keep talking about the international rule of law, right? But where did the rule of law go in, with reference to Israel's punitive vendetta in Gaza and turning a blind eye on what's going on, the ongoing occupation of the West Bank and allowing settlers to advance in the West Bank? I mean, we need to be we need to have a straight face when we talk about the international rule of law, and this is also perhaps in relationship with India and India's behavior in extraterritorial and extrajudicial killings outside of its borders, something that China, for instance, notably does not engage in. And the fact that if we like to emphasize universal values very often, we have to be careful with regards to democratic backsliding overall. Southeast Asian countries are witnessing democratic backsliding, and that's also why perhaps it makes better sense to talk about effective multilateralism and cooperation in preserving the status quo and preserving a modicum of rules-based order internationally rather than focusing on democratic values. So this is where I come from, and I think that there are more tensions there, and those tensions are coming to the fore more clearly. Because why do I emphasize it? Because precisely because there is competition, more and more competition, it gives fodder to Russian propaganda or to Chinese talking points with regard to, well, where did the rule of law go in Palestine? We are really the honest brokers of the global South, right? So perhaps if we want to be the honest brokers with the global South, we need to be a bit more coherent. And I guess I'll stop here because we have 15 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Giulio, and thank you, Stephen, for your very pertinent questions. I think we've got 100 plus registrants today, so I think we'd like to collect some of the questions from the viewers online. And I would like to first, I'd like to take several questions, and I think Giulio may wish to answer in one go. I think you touched upon Gaza, the conflict in Gaza already in the international law aspect, but here's the one from Arab News, Mr. Azhari, my good old friend, asking you, what is the impact of Israel war in Gaza on the Japan, Europe, USA military cooperation alliance? That's one. And from a different angle, Mr. James Angelus, asking you, how do you see the Global Combat Air Program, GCAP, proceeding, and what other business prospects do you envision in the future? And slightly different aspect, Valerie Nikkei, our senior fellow in JIIA, sends you this question, seeing the tremendous importance of Indo-Pacific SLOC, a sea line of communication between Europe and Japan, do you see a possibility for Japan to play a role in maintaining security in the Red Sea area? So those are the questions.
Well, I have to confess that some of them really are outside of my remit, but I'll be very brief precisely because they're outside of my remit then. On the military repercussions of the Gaza, of the Israel-Palestine war, well, it goes back to the earlier point about the United States' role in the region. The United States has emphasized great power competition and the willingness to tilt, really, and to pivot to this part of the world. But clearly, as the Al Pacino in The Godfather 3, there's this famous line, once I thought I was all out, they pulled me back in. And clearly the United States is pulled back in. It's pulled back in. You see the military assets at sea in the region, very incredible. They have 2 aircraft carrier battle groups in the Eastern Mediterranean. The United States, of course, wants to now send as many assets as possible to avoid that the conflict escalates into something bigger that actually makes the conflict then very hard to manage. So much so that clearly the United States and Iran have both sent out notifications that they will keep, they are going to, keep Iran out of the question here. And they want to keep the peace with Iran. And they might have, in fact, been pulled in from other actors. So this is how I understand, in a nutshell, the military side effects. One non-military side effect, and it could go both ways, right? That the fact that, if the US successfully manages to avoid the escalation of the conflict, it can then devote assets to the Indo-Pacific. But this is going to be an election year. And Biden clearly, because of domestic politics, has shown an inability to more strongly criticize Netanyahu's position. And Netanyahu's position in Gaza is a maximalist one that doesn't have clear strategic objectives. In fact, it might actually go against and run against Israel's strategic objectives. So we're going to potentially have a war that might actually prolong itself for a while. And this is then leaves it open-ended. Another key point, very quickly, is that the connectivity initiative that the United States has tried to launch between India, the United Arab Emirates, going through Saudi Arabia and Israel, and of course the ability for Middle Eastern and Gulf states to sort of like get together with Israel and normalize relations, notably Saudi Arabia and Israel, that's going to be put in, at the very least, on a timeout for the time being, I think. And I'll stop here. Yeah.
Yes, Stephen.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on that first question, because I think we often think about Japan, EU, and US in terms of military or security cooperation. But when it comes to the Gaza crisis and Israelis' efforts to quash Hamas in Gaza, and I think it's important to look at China's position. And China has taken a position where they did not criticize Hamas and its actions in an effort to court the so-called global South. And I think this is a very, very strong signal that China sees the competition in global institutions and global multilateralism through the lens of the global South. And for the US and the EU and Japan, this is a signpost. We need to do more to tell a better story, to help the developing countries to deal with the issues that they're facing. Because if we're not working with them, if we're not cultivating strong relationships and dealing with their issues, what's going to happen is it's going to weaken international institutions. And we need international institutions and multilateralism to deal with many challenges within the Indo-Pacific and globally. And I think, again, we should pivot just away from the security side and think about what it means in terms of how we can concentrate our collective diplomacy to deal with the challenges of development in the developing world that are represented by the support for the Palestinian cause, and how China is, I think, leveraging this support, not so much to support the developing world, but to support its own interests in diluting international institutions, diluting the ideas of democracy, human rights, and ultimately so-called Western norms that really have brought peace and prosperity in the post-World War II period.
Well, thank you very much. I think Japan has got a wonderful track record in supporting Gaza in terms of water sanitation and the betterment of the people's livelihoods. But I think more needs to be told, needs to be done in the public relations. But anyway, so I think you're in the middle of the.
I'm sorry, and I'll be very brief here. Okay, now past week we have had the official announcement of the GCAP intergovernmental organization, which would be in London with the US, with a Japanese chairman or president, but it will be a rotating one. Yes, what is interesting here is that it is a development of a new fighter jet that Japan was supposed to do on its own. Then it joined hand with the UK. Then Italy jumped into it, and it is notable because the US was not chosen as a part of choice from Japan, perhaps because of black boxing from the US and the inability to give technology know-how, share it with Japan. But what is interesting here, I emphasize the economic components of it. This is helpful for technological development, the ability to then harness the technological expertise of all three countries to develop not just the hardware, the fighter jet itself, the platform, but the system of systems. And this is hardly talked about, the software behind it. And the software will be an important aspect of this joint development because it will eventually cascade into all sorts of civic applications as well, with potential economic repercussions for the economy writ large, so civil use. Now, what is the potential problem, I suspect, from the little reading I have done, is that these systems, the new fighter jets, you would operate normally with unmanned aerial vehicles. And from the looks of it, Japan is going to go for joint development and procurement of unmanned aerial vehicles with the United States. So how is the GCAP going to actually fit in with that? That's not clear to me. And that's a conversation worth having. And I'm sure that behind closed doors, people are already having. But it's part of the prospects that I was asked to talk about. And at the last question by Valerie. Hi, Valerie. I think that Japan has already been shown the ability to be present with the Djibouti military base, participation in EUNAVFOR off the Gulf of Aden, anti-piracy issues. Japan has been also playing up from the 2019, if I'm not mistaken, near the Strait of Hormuz. It has been sending military vessels. You've asked about the Red Sea. I don't think Japan would venture to the Red Sea, but I'm not an expert really, and perhaps I'll pass the hot potatoes to Stephen then.
I think I'll pass the hot potato back to Koichi.
Well, yeah, we engaged in the anti-piracy activities until quite recently, and I think they reduced the operation quite a bit. And I think we're now in the mood of concentrating our forces in East Asia, which is the real hot potato. So probably with that, I will just move on to several other questions because we've got 7 more minutes and I've got more than 10 questions. And I think the question posed by Guillaume Canard-Duchesne, I think was answered because you talked about US, whether US would let Japan join forces more with the EU and its member states. I think that was something that you talked about earlier. So I think that one is quite well answered. Another question coming from Ms. Anne Semadani George. She asks you, could ASEAN make things more difficult for Japan in this situation? Which is a very philosophical question as well. Now, a question coming from Philip Shelter-Jones. He says, what trends in EU Indo-Pacific policy might we see emerge from the next European Commission after Parliament election in June 2024? So, yeah, maybe let you answer. I'll let you answer those two.
But the last question is about how ASEAN countries will respond as Japan and Europe increase defense cooperation. I think that ASEAN countries need to be divided, first and foremost, between littoral states that have maritime and territorial disputes with China and take and benefit from the presence in the South China Sea, and perhaps in terms of capacity building exercises and the possibility to also endow these states with military or constabulary assets. Those states are very different from others such as Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, who clearly are less interested in competition with China, don't have those degree of disputes with China. And even within the littoral states that I've mentioned, so the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, but especially Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, Singapore, territorial and maritime disputes, okay? Even within that cohort, clearly under the current presidency in the Philippines, there is a much more combative stance. One that is also coordinating more actively with the United States, with Australia, with Japan. And ASEAN countries are less, I would say, forthcoming. So it's really a matter of how you define ASEAN. What is ASEAN? I think ASEAN is under a lot of stress, not just because of, you know, the diversity of reactions to China's rise. And they cannot also move away from the region, and they depend very much on China economically, including Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam is very combative vis-a-vis China. But let's not forget that there was a very successful state visit by Xi Jinping in Vietnam recently. And so we see cooperation like the one that hasn't been announced at the ASEAN-Japan 50-year anniversary in terms of security provisions through the official security assistance. I think that the Philippines is the one that is more happy, really. But other countries within ASEAN, you know, hedge their bets. So this doesn't do justice to a very big question. And this won't do justice to Philip. Hi, Philip's question. You know, hi, Philip. I don't know what's going to be the next commission like. Von der Leyen is not liked a lot, by the way, nowadays because of her stance in Israel. She took it, you know, she took the initiative in Israel. Not many member states, including, you know, the High Representative Borrell is on the same page with von der Leyen. And the von der Leyen Commission has also taken, you know, a step too far, perhaps, on the economic security agenda. And we don't know what's going to happen at the next parliamentary elections in the European Parliament. We might get a more right-wing, kind of like populist set of representation. So I won't take the von der Leyen Geopolitical Commission for granted. It's really tricky to answer that question, or at least because the Indo-Pacific is half the world, effectively. It's spanning from East Africa to the Western Pacific. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. I still have a couple of minutes left, and I would like to open the floor for any comments and questions from the floor, if you have any. Going once, going twice. Okay, so that concludes our webinar for today, and I think we have so many takeaways. Thanks to Giulio and Stephen. I personally found, you know, talking about security situation in Asia with Europeans a bit difficult in a way, because there was very little convergence back in like 15, 20 years ago. But now we have a very almost full convergence of views on the security situations and security, threat perceptions, if you will. And I sense that very much in my recent visits to Europe these days. And I think my meeting with Giulio in Oxford was one of those examples, and today is just another example. So we should sort of accumulate this kind of, you know, dialogue each and every time we meet. And well, once again, please join me in thanking Giulio and Stephen for the wonderful discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much. And that concludes today's webinar. And before you go, please sign up for our mail magazine, and please register for our future talks. And please do answer some of the questions that you will see after you log off. There's a questionnaire that you need to fill in. You may want to fill in. So please be kind enough to do so. And so apart from that, I think this is going to be the last webinar for this year. So happy holidays and see you next year. Thank you very much.